Hi, and welcome to the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinsko, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, speaker, and general explorer when it comes to customer and employee experience. I'm really interested in figuring out what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees. So with that in mind, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, authors and academics to uncover some clues about what it takes to build such an organization. Now, some of you may know the podcast as the Rare Business Podcast, but I decided to rename and rebrand the podcast recently. This is for a number of reasons. First one was to mirror the title of my book Punk CX, which was published in June 2019. 2, because I'm a fan of punk music. And 3, it's just more fun, right? If this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then hello and welcome. Please do dive into the archives at adrianswinsko.com, as I've now completed over 300 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then welcome back and thank you. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have Stefan Tomke, who is the William Barclay Harding Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. Hi, Stefan. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Adrian.
You're very welcome. Now, Stefan, welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you today. But before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and also about the work that you do?
So, Adrian, I'm a professor, as you said, at Harvard Business School. I've been here for 25 years. I'm originally from Germany, where I grew up. I'm an engineer by training. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I got interested in experimentation while I was in graduate school at MIT. And worked for a while, and again joined the Harvard Business School in 1995. And I study innovation there, innovation, product development, mm-hmm. Operations, also practice it. Mm-hmm. And I've been in the field of experimentation now for a long time, more than 25 years. And discovered it more in the engineering context, mm-hmm. product engineering, and then later on sort of realized that this is much, much bigger than that.
Perfect. Now, talking about experimentation, you've just actually written a new book called Experimentation Works, The Surprising Power of Business Experiments. Now, I mean, you've sort of been alluding to that, but can you tell me about the book and tell me about it, how it came about, who's it for, and so what's its main sort of thesis?
Yes, Adrian, that's a great question. As I mentioned, I've been working on experimentation for a long time. I actually wrote my first book in 2003 called Experimentation Matters, and that was more about how experimentation technologies are changing the way product development and R&D is being done. Mm-hmm. I thought I was done. I thought I had discovered everything there was to be discovered, and the book did quite well. And I went off and started to focus on other things. And then I realized that experimentation was moving out of sort of just product engineering or R&D, and it's being used in lots of different settings, especially online. And got really curious and got right back into the field and started to follow all these exciting things and realized that maybe there is room for another book.
Wow.
And so that's how Experimentation Works started. And the idea of the book is that experimentation is something that a whole organization needs to fully embrace. Mm-hmm. It's a mindset, it's an approach to decision making, to innovation. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to capture sort of in this new book, Experimentation Works, all the changes that have happened in the last few years in the experimentation space, especially in online, but also in brick and mortar. Give the reader a guidebook on how to do all this, and fill it up with frameworks, company examples, and so forth, and to really sort of give everyone a state of the art, and but also conceptually explain sort of why experimentation is so important.
Right. And Stefan, to give people, I mean, what I want to do is actually give people a flavor of the book. I mean, we don't want to go through it chapter and verse because obviously, like most authors, you want people to go and buy the book. But what we want to do is we want to give people a flavor of the book. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to dig into a few areas or themes, if I may, just to bring the whole thing to life. And the first thing I want to do is, so I must ask you, it's like, which brands or organizations do you think, or would you classify as the best when it comes to experimentation? Because I think it's important, rather than it's, talking about just theory, but actually talking about examples, and then we can almost fix in people's kind of minds is like, oh, that's the sort of thing that those people do, and that's how they do it.
Yes, large-scale experimentation is used by, I would say, lots of different companies, but the ones that do it, I think, really well is maybe about a dozen or so.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the usual suspects, a Microsoft or a Google or a
Mm-hmm.
Netflix. Booking.com, in the Netherlands is another example that's prominent in my book as well. And they run many experiments. And when I say many, Adrian, I mean tens of thousands annually, live on you and me.
Right.
So every time we go, Adrian, every time we open up a Netflix movie or we book something on booking.com, or we Google or go to Microsoft, something that we've probably done in the last 24 hours, we are a part of the experimentation ecosystem that they have.
Right.
They try things on us all the time. We just don't know about it.
And how, you call those organizations experimentation organizations. I mean, but also the interesting thing, and I guess this people might be amazed by the kind of the extent of experimentation. We talk about tens of thousands of different experiments kind of per year with these organizations, but they might be sort of overwhelmed by I feel like the scale of that type of endeavor. But to give them a sense of the, if you like, the reward or the returns that are that come from being that way. You put together like an index of the stock performance of what you call experimentation organizations vis-a-vis the kind of S&P 500 over the last kind of few years. I mean, can you tell us about how they've done versus the stock market?
They've done extraordinarily well. Now, it was just a fun exercise, Adrian. Because as I was studying these companies, I asked around leaders in the field, who are the top companies in this field of online experimentation. And then once I had sort of all the names, I thought, why don't we actually look up their stock performance, the ones that were public, and compare it to the S&P 500, and they outperformed it extraordinarily. Now, as we know, correlation is not causation.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not claiming that just experimenting caused sort of outside stock performance, but I think it's pretty clear to everyone in the field that the ability to run large-scale experimentation was a factor in their performance, because they could have not done the things that they did unless they had this large-scale experimentation capability available to them. And I can give you some examples which may illustrate sort of to the listener sort of how powerful this could be.
No, that'd be useful, because actually kind of my next question was going to be, you talk about experimentation, but I'm like going, okay, what does that mean? Because when I think about experiments, I think about lab coats and test tubes and Bunsen burners and that type of things. But you're talking about online experiments. I mean, so what would constitute an experiment? And please give us a couple of examples if you can.
Yeah, let me maybe start with the example, and then I'll give you a definition.
Okay.
Because the example, I think, illustrates nicely what's going on here. So this is an example that comes from Microsoft. It's also in the book. And that example really opened up my eyes. So So here is a Microsoft employee who was working on Bing, that's the search engine. And the employee had an idea about changing the way ad headlines are displayed. And the idea itself seemed trivial. What they wanted to do is he wanted to take some of the ads subtext and move it up to the headline.
Mm-hmm.
And explain that to his boss. And of course, the problem is in a place like Microsoft, they get hundreds of ideas every single day like this. So the program manager itself deemed this to be a low priority, didn't think sort of much of it. The change itself wasn't a big deal. It would only take about a few days of an engineer's time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the thing was shelved.
Right.
About 6 months later, the employee ran out of patience and decided just to launch it on his own without the program manager's permission. And as he launched it, an alarm went off. Now, Microsoft monitors, KPIs, key performance indicators, automatically. Mm-hmm. They have many of those. And when something unusual happens, an alarm just goes off. So this alarm was the too good to be true alarm. The good to be alarm. So it goes off and they immediately stop the experiment. And usually when that happens, there's a bug in the software, so they investigate and they found there is no bug in the software. They run it again and the experiment replicates. Now, what is amazing is that small change, that really tiny change, resulted in an increase of more than $100 million of revenue in the first year alone.
Wow.
And without hurting any key user experience metrics. So it was kind of amazing. Now, why am I telling this story? Well, the story illustrates really two things. The first issue here is that unless the employee didn't run the experiment, hadn't run the experiment, they would have never known. Microsoft would have never known that they could have made an extra $100 million of revenue per year.
Yeah.
So they would have left a lot of money on the table. The second thing it also illustrates that in the online world, small changes can make a huge difference. Usually in innovation, we think about big, disruptive or breakthrough innovations. Well, in this world, you can make small changes and you can scale it to a lot of people and it can have a huge impact on revenue. So I thought it would be a good example just to illustrate some really, really important things as you're trying to run these online experiments.
Mm-hmm.
So your next question, Adrian, was what is an experiment, right?
Well, exactly. That's what I was going to say. So, but give us the definition, Stefan.
So, I'm an academic, of course, right? So you need to have a definition.
Uh-huh.
So the way we think about sort of experiments is, and I'll start with an ideal experiment and sort of almost a textbook experiment. So if you have an ideal experiment, the tester, so you, will separate an independent variable. So that's the presumed cause. So for example, that would be, say, a bonus for the sales force.
Right.
From a dependent variable, which is the variable that you observe, which would be in this example, perhaps, is the sales revenue by the salespeople that you're giving the incentive to. And now the next sort of extension is important, while holding everything else constant.
Ceteris paribus.
Other potential causes. That's important because you're only interested in that one variable that you're changing, in this case, perhaps the sales incentive.
Mm-hmm.
You're not interested in anything else. And the worry is, of course, is if other things change along the way, they may pollute the experiment and you won't be able to actually sort of to separate sort of cause and effect.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we typically do in a laboratory environment, but you immediately kind of see what the problem is, and that's holding all other potential causes constant.
Yeah, that was a problem kind of like when I was studying economics, and I think the Latin expression for that is ceteris paribus, which is other things remaining equal, or OTRE, and that was always the thing that kind of got the analysis into trouble.
Exactly. So in a laboratory setting, the way we would do this is, of course, we would try to control everything that we can control, except for that one variable that we're changing,
Mm-hmm.
which is the learning, essentially, right? Learning about cause and effect. Now, the in experimental design, they came up with a really clever trick, many years ago, and it's called randomization.
Right.
And so what they would do is they would say, well, we can't hold all other causes constant, but what we can do with sort of the help of randomization is we can actually take all the other causes and we'll distribute sort of them randomly across the different treatments. And so that means that the other causes are still present and they may still change, but they don't bias one or the other.
Right.
And so that was, I thought actually randomization is a brilliant idea.
Uh-huh.
And that gets you, it's not exactly the same, but it gets you pretty close to the, what you call everything else being equal.
Yes. Fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean,
so go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so that is essentially, and then what you would do, of course, is you measure the differences in treatment effects as you're sort of trying to do that. And now, what you will quickly, see here is that what we mean by the word experiment, usually in sort of the English language, we often use the word experiment as we are trying something, or but it's here we're using the word experiment in a fairly rigorous way. It's a discipline.
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially the scientific method sort of at work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of what the book is all about. So the book is the introduction to this discipline of experimentation rather than just trial and error.
Okay. I mean, and I guess my question from that is like this kind of discipline. I mean, do you need a certain type of culture to be able to become that type of experimentation organization? Because that does feel like a bit of like a mindset sort of shift, be able to
Yes.
want to run these things continuously. Because it's like, how some people are, they're like going, oh, we need to become more agile, or we need to become more innovative. And then they create a team or a function to take care of that. And then nothing happens. So,
Adrian, it takes a total change of attitude. It's a different way of making decisions. It's a different way of innovating, and I identified several cultural elements that are necessary to make this work at large scale.
mm-hmm.
Let me give you a few examples of.
Okay.
Yeah. So first thing that I sort of found that's really important here is in the research and is to cultivate curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone in an organization, from the leadership on down, needs to value surprises.
Right.
So that's a mindset,
Yes.
and you need to hire for that. You need to train for that. You need to appreciate it. And when you have this mindset, then curiosity prevails. And people will see failures not as costly mistakes, but they see it as opportunities for learning. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is insisting that data trump opinions.
Yeah.
I always tell people, if you already made up your mind, why experiment? If the decision is already made, why run an experiment? So in a true, what I call experimentation organization, in a culture that embraces experiments, the results of the experiment must prevail, even when they clash with strong opinions, no matter whose opinions they are, even the boss. And the problem, of course, is, so why don't we do that? The problem, of course, is human nature. We tend to happily accept good results, that confirm our biases, but we challenge and thoroughly investigate bad results that go against our assumption. And so we have to really keep ourselves disciplined. And by the way, Adrian, I'm not saying that we need to blindly follow the experimental results.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you get the results of an experiment, and it may result in an action that you don't want to take.
Yes.
maybe, goes against your strategy or may violate a contractual commitment that you have. And so, but when we run the experiment, at least we're adding transparency sort of to the decision. That is, we know why we're taking the decision, so we can't fool ourselves that we're taking the decision because it's good for the customer or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's the second element, Adrian, and I have a few more. The third one I think is really important, and that may be the hardest one, is what I call democratize experimentation.
Right.
And that is empowering people to run their own experiments. In fact, at Booking.com, anybody can launch an experiment on millions of customers without management's permission. Now, and in fact, they're about 75% of sort of their core technology and product staffers actively do that. Now, that usually scares companies.
Yeah, no, but I was just thinking about that, and I was thinking, well, do they know? I mean, yes, do they need to coordinate the experiments that they're doing? Now, they might not necessarily do it from a centralized control perspective, but just coordinate the experiments, because going back to that idea of you want to understand cause and effects, because if everybody's running experiments all of the time and simultaneously, then that could create all sorts of interesting, in quotes, sort of like results.
Absolutely. So they all use the same platform, so
right.
That helps. In order for this to work, Adrian, and you're absolutely right, in order for this to work, you have to put a few things in place.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, total transparency.
Mm.
So whenever somebody wants to launch a new experiment, they will in fact broadcast the experiment to everybody else in the organization. And people will actually look at these experiments and give them feedback. They may say, I think this is a poor experiment, or they may say that I've run an experiment like this before and this is what happened. So total transparency. They also have a database where all the experiments are stored, including the results, and anybody there has access to that database.
Right.
So before you run an experiment, you can go in the database and look up what others have done. Anybody at Booking can stop any experiment. And so they call it the nuclear option.
Okay.
If you launch an experiment in the evening and you go home and suddenly your experiment tanks, somebody else can actually stop it for you. So, I mean, I think you get it. They have a whole bunch of sort of things in place that make sure that this actually works. Ethics is another issue, right? You want to train people to make sure that they run ethical experiments, especially if you don't have management oversight. And so they create a whole system that allows them to sort of get away with that. And that brings me to my fourth element, which I think is really important as well, and that is being ethically sensitive.
Yes.
It's you suddenly, when you can run tens of thousands of experiments live on customers like you and me and your listeners, I mean, that's kind of like a superpower. Right?
Well, yeah,
so
no, absolutely.
With great power comes great responsibility. So you need to make sure that that what you're running is ethical, or at least perceived as ethical.
Mm-hmm.
You don't abuse that power, and sometimes companies who go over the line, can face a huge backlash, as Facebook has in the past and others.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Really important. Yes, go ahead.
I think they're absolutely right, and those kind of dimensions are kind of really important. I mean, but I guess the thing I'm interested in is that in the book you also go into kind of details around kind of different stages of
Yes.
maturity that organizations go through to kind of reach this goal of becoming like an experimentation organization. But I guess what I'm kind of interested in is there's a big difference between not being that and then sort of getting and getting started, as it were. And actually, in many ways, I think what we were talking about before is like sometimes when you're dealing with an environment of uncertainty, which we're kind of in right now, than actually not making a decision and get paralyzed by kind of uncertainty um, it could be catastrophic. And actually, you need to just get started in many ways. So I
Yes.
guess my question was going to be is like, well, what if somebody was listening to this or reading the highlights and they're thinking, yeah, that sounds good. I want to run more experiments to learn, to be able to learn more about my customers and kind of to be able to deliver, greater innovation or better service or better experience. I mean, where should they start? I mean, what's the first thing they should be doing? Because I think that's the point where, because if they almost like start on the experimentation journey, what's the best first couple of steps that they should take?
You're absolutely right, Adrian. Whenever I give people the examples of an Amazon or Booking.com or Microsoft and them running tens of thousands of experiments live, they get scared. I said, wow, we can't do that. And I point out to them that all these companies started out small at some point. Booking started out small, and they ran very few experiments when they started out. And so I have a continuum, of different. Well, I have different stages really that companies typically go through based on my observations, and all the companies, even the best in class examples, at some point had to go through these stages. The reality is most companies who are experimenting are starting out small today. And they don't run sort of that many experiments. They may run maybe a few or dozens of experiments per year. The stages that I've identified typically fall into 5 categories. And I have a nifty framework around that in the book. It's called the ABCDE, easy to remember. And let me tell you what the letters stand for, because these are the stages. You typically start with A and you end up with E, which is the experimentation organization. It starts with what I call awareness.
Right.
So the first stage. And that means you have to understand that experimentation matters, that it's important. And quite honestly, whenever I talk about this, most executives will understand that this is an important capability that you really need to pay attention to. The B stands for believe. That is, it's more than just being aware. You have to believe in it, and that requires you to adopt some rigorous framework of what experimentation is, kind of like what we just discussed. It requires you to get tools. Tools play an important role here as well, and there are great tools available today. Then the C stands for commitment. So then the next level up. Commitment now means that I need to allocate some serious resources, and I need to rethink how my organization actually runs. Am I set up for this the right way? Do I give this to one small group somewhere in the organization, or should I go more broadly? Which then takes me up to the next high level, which I call D for diffusion. And in diffusion that's when the scale starts to happen. We widen the scope. We try to get a lot of people involved in an organization, not just 2 or 3 people, who are running this in some small department. And we give people throughout the organization access to tools. And then when that happens, that brings us then to the final stage, which is embeddedness, so E.
Right.
And that's about democratizing experimentation. This is the example that I just gave you, where everybody in an organization can run experiments without permission. It's an environment where experimentation becomes almost like breathing.
Yeah.
You don't even have to tell people to run experiments. It's second nature to them. Yeah. So that's the ultimate. That's nirvana, Adrian.
Well, yeah, no, and it's like a long road that to travel, but I think it puts it into context. But it tells us kind of like, people have to ask, that gives them, you give people a kind of framework to understand where they might be. And I would imagine that, as you say, many people might be at kind of the A, many others might be cultivating the B, but it's the C bit which is the biggest kind of hurdle. And as we approach a a period where I'm pretty sure that the economic conditions are going to tighten, as well as investment budgets, then the commitment part of it may actually be the hardest part for many.
I agree, Adrian. I think most organizations are stuck at A or B. Mm-hmm. And then once you can start going up, even to C, I think that it starts to thin out pretty quickly.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit, Stefan. So do you think, do you think that the future of service and experience is going to be, what do you think it looks like? I mean, is it going to be defined by experimentation? I mean, are we entering, do you think, from your perspective, that we're entering such a changed period that we don't know what the outlook is, that actually experimentation is the only way forward right now?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm convinced.
Well, of course, you just wrote a book about it, I guess.
Yes. Try to imagine the future. And by the way, the future is already here. Mm-hmm. I just look, I'm an engineer. I love technology. And if I just look at what's happening in the technology space, it blows my mind. Nowadays, if you just look at an iPhone, the computational capability of an iPhone today is equivalent to a supercomputer in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. And so as we're moving forward, and we're seeing that customers are engaging with us through many different channels, mm-hmm. As we're seeing an explosion in technology, as we're seeing these devices becoming more and more powerful, we're also facing an explosion of touch points. That is, the way we interact with our customers, the way they experience us as a company. And the question, Adrian, that I ask myself is, how are companies going to optimize all these touch points? We can't even imagine, how customers will interact with us 5 years from now, 10 years from now. It's going to blow us away. I mean, just think back, could you have imagined sort of what we could do today 5 years ago, 10 years ago? I certainly couldn't. And so again, how are we going to optimize all these experiences that customers have? Well, we could sit there and we could try to guess, we could try to make decisions, but as you've seen in my book, it turns out that the companies that run these experiments today find that they're wrong about 8 to 9 out of 10 times, and these are the best in the field. Mm-hmm. These are the experts are wrong 8 to 9 out of 10 times. So trying to predict what customers will do, trying to predict customer behavior, I think is a fool's errand. It doesn't work. So the only way we can adjudicate these decisions, the way we can figure out how to give customers these amazing experiments and to resolve all these touch points, is through massive experimentation.
Awesome. So, Stefan, I mean, I think that's going to give our kind of listeners and kind of readers a bit of a flavor of kind of like what's in the book. And I mean, there's a lot of depth in there and a lot of great insight and great advice and things. I mean, is there anything else that you'd like to kind of like, cover or add that we've missed out before I ask you a couple of kind of final questions I always ask at the end of these kind of interviews?
I mean, to me, one of the things I think, yes, there's a lot of details in the book about how to do this, why we should be doing this, and that's why I wrote the book, of course. So in some level, it's a guidebook. Mm-hmm. But I want to make sure that your listeners take away sort of also the bigger picture, and that is that experimentation is also a mindset and ethos.
Yes.
And that's what I wanted to bring across here as well. And it really is a continuation of something that started 400 years ago. It's the scientific method. Mm-hmm. Francis Bacon, started out with Novum Organum in 1620. Yeah. And it's been a wild journey since then. He called it a new instrument for building and organizing knowledge. And boy, we've come a long way. You can't even imagine the world today without the scientific method. And this is essentially the scientific method turbocharged.
Yes.
because now we can sort of do it at a scale that Francis Bacon could have never imagined. And so it's a mindset and ethos, to basically approach decisions, approach sort of innovation experimentally.
Mm-hmm.
And to always ask yourself sort of what the experiment. There's a great quote, if I may,
Sure.
Adrian, which I love to sort of always tell sort of people. It comes from Richard Feynman, who is a very famous physicist, one of the smartest, I think, person in the 20th century, a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He was a very colorful character. But he once said, which I think pretty much nails it, he said, it doesn't make any difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't make any difference how smart you are, who made the guess or what his name is. And I can insert, or how beautiful the PowerPoints are. It doesn't matter where you're on the hierarchy. And he said, if it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it. I think it's just brilliant.
Yeah.
It pretty much nails it. And that's what it's all about. And if Richard Feynman, who is, again, it's one of the smartest sort of person who's ever lived, can say that, I think we can all admit to that as well. That
Absolutely.
It's the experiment that's going to tell us whether we are wrong or whether we're right. So that's sort of, I think, a takeaway, a big takeaway. And the book, of course, tells you how it's done, Adrian.
Super. Thank you so much. I mean, that's a great, I know of Richard Feynman. I've read some of his stuff, and yes, I mean, he was a brilliant mind and also a colorful character.
For sure. Yes.
But
real punk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And kind of talking about punks, I mean, he was a punk in the physics field, very much so. Yeah. And bringing on to the kind of punk theme, I mean, what I've been doing for the last year on the back of writing the Punk CX book is I've been asking everybody I've been speaking to a couple of questions, just as a piece of, I feel like, ongoing social research. And what we've been doing is, the first question I've been asking them is that, what one or two words would you use to describe a more punk approach to sort of experience or service, or what words would, if I said punk and experience, what one or two words would kind of crop into your mind?
Now, Adrian, the way I remember the punk movement is that it encompasses a lot of things. One aspect of punk that at least I remember is do it yourself, is empowerment. It's don't take it from authority, don't take something for granted. And I think experimentation is a perfect fit. Don't listen to what people tell you, find out yourself. And own it. And experimentation may just be the tool for punkers.
Fantastic. I love it.
It's what they need,
I'm loving it.
Yeah.
And so the second question is, what sort of company or organization, or brand or something, do you think epitomizes that sort of punk ethos?
Well, I mean, at some level, it's stage E, embeddedness, right? That to me is almost like a punk ethos, democratizing experimentation. That is, you don't take it for granted anymore. You just go out and test it. I think Booking.com is one of the companies that I listed, and there's actually a fun example that I think explains that ethos. There was a former CEO, a new CEO that came into Booking.com, and he sat down with the team, and they had to decide on a new logo. And they were having a discussion. And at the end of the meeting, the new CEO said, okay, I got all the inputs and I made a decision. This is what the logo is going to look like. The employees looked at them and said, well, that's really interesting. We're going to run the experiment and let you know what happens.
Right.
That, I think, exemplifies that punk ethos, is that we don't listen to authority. We don't listen to the CEO. Yeah. We're going to go out and find out ourselves whether something's going to work or not.
Yeah. Wow. That's cool. I mean, it's like, check your ego at the door.
Exactly. And so I think CEOs need to learn that. Because if decisions are driven by ego and and all the sorts of things, this is not going to work.
Yeah.
In fact, it was one of the executives at Booking who told me, it's interesting. He said, if I had any advice for CEOs, it's this. He said, large scale testing is not a technical thing. It's a cultural thing that you need to fully embrace. And he raised two interesting questions for CEO. And I think that, again, exemplifies sort of maybe that punk approach to things. He said, the two questions is how willing are you to be confronted every day by how wrong you are, and how much autonomy are you willing to give to the people who work for you? Mm. And if the answer is no to these questions, it's never going to work.
Mm. Absolutely. No, thank you. That's a good, I mean, it just epitomizes that whole thing is about being the willingness to be wrong and to be open about kind of things and to learn and things. So that's great.
And to challenge authority.
Yeah, no, completely.
In a way, you don't challenge them just by being stubborn. You challenge them with the experiment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Fantastic. Stefan, that's what a great way to wrap up. I mean, just wanted to say, first of all, congratulations on the book. I think it's a great piece of work. It's an important topic. And just finally, thank you for sharing your time and your insights with us today. That's been super cool.
Thanks for having me, Adrian. Was a lot of fun.
Well, that was cool. I hope you enjoyed it. I did, and I always do actually, because I always learn something new when I speak to some of these amazing kind of people. And it's always something new that I can incorporate into my writing, speaking, workshops, and other sort of advisory work that I do. Now, if you're interested in learning about any of that sort of stuff, then you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswinscoe.com. One final thing before I go, please consider heading over to iTunes or Spotify or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as they say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do tune in again soon. All the very best. Cheers. Bye.